Okay everyone, welcome to another installment of the CEAP Avian Training video series. I am DJ McNeil, the instructor for this presentation, as well as one of the CEAP crew leaders. Remember, if you have any questions with anything in this presentation, to send me an email. If you're watching this presentation, more than likely you already have my email. I should also remind you that the CEAP Avian Training video series should be considered a supplement to your present study regime for passerine identification. This should not be the sole source of your bird ID refresher. With that said, this particular installment is a bit different than some of the others. Most of the others are single kind of taxon or general group presentations, whereas this one's a bit of a grab bag. More specifically, I've lumped three groups of birds kind of into this presentation. As you can see, the flycatchers, the vireos, and the thrushes. So we're going to talk about them starting with the flycatchers. Okay, so we're going to begin by talking about the eastern kingbird. In general, flycatchers are a pretty difficult group of birds. Many of them are drab and gray with light-colored wing bars and a light-colored underside, and generally are very difficult to tell apart. And for that reason, I started with the eastern kingbird because, in my opinion, it's one of the easiest of the flycatchers to identify. They're in a group known as the tyrant flycatchers, which are the larger flycatchers. The kingbird certainly lives up to that name, as well as the name kingbird. It's a very aggressive species, pursuing birds of prey and other large birds out of its territory. Okay, so the kingbird, as I mentioned, is quite easy to identify. We see that the bird has a black kind of overall back, and the top of the head is black, the wings are black, the rump is black, everything is really black on the upper side, contrasting sharply with a white belly. And then finally, the kingbird is identifiable. Perhaps the single most distinctive trait, in my opinion, of the kingbird is the white tail tip, as shown here. The vocalizations are also pretty straightforward. Kingbirds produce a series of harsh, sputtering squeaks. Here's an example. But they also produce a variety of different forms of this similar squeaky call. Here is a different variation of that. And another. But overall, the kingbird's calls are quite consistent in that they're this harsh, buzzy, squeaky call. The gray-crested flycatcher is the next bird in our group. This one, again, is not too difficult, one of the easier flycatchers. For one, it's very large. The gray-crested flycatcher is quite a bit larger than any other typical flycatcher you would see. The kingbird is also large. True to its name, the great crested flycatcher sports a pretty large crest, but as you can see from this individual, the crest can be lowered and hidden, just like with most bird species. But even when the crest is depressed, great crested flycatchers have a gray face and throat, for one, and this fades into a sulfur-colored belly, flank, and undertail coverts. Those two things alone often are enough to identify the great crested flycatcher, but in addition to those two things, they have this rufous wing patch, the primary flight feathers, as well as a rufous tail. So that collection of characteristics, again, also notice the huge bill on this bird, are pretty distinctive. No eye ring to speak of. The great crested flycatcher is pretty straightforward. It does have wing bars, but this collection of characteristics we see is really not found on anything else in our area. The vocalizations are also quite easy to remember. It produces a lot of calls that sounds essentially like the bird is screaming. The first vocalization I learned for the great crested flycatcher was the wheep or creep call. Sounds almost like the bird is being assaulted and it's screaming, "Creep!" And in addition to the clearer rising weep or creep call, they also do that pert, pert, pert call, which is a little bit more of a trill, a lower pitched call. Also notice that the gray-crested flycatcher is a very boisterous, very loud bird. Here's an example of a couple of gray-crested flycatchers calling back and forth. And another pair. The Eastern Phoebe is another really easy flycatcher. We're kind of starting you with the easy ones and going to work into the more difficult ones. The Phoebe is distinctive in a couple of ways. First, the head and back are a really dark, kind of a gray-brown. Those that dark color isn't really found on any of the other flycatchers that we're going to talk about. The olive-sided, to some extent, does have a darker back, but not nearly as a dark brownish gray as the Eastern Phoebe. Additionally, the Eastern Phoebe has this kind of sulfur-colored belly, as well as these very, at least partial of a vest here, so to speak. So imagine that the bird is wearing a gray vest, and you kind of see a little bit of one of those. A couple of the other flycatchers we're going to talk about also have a vest, but a vest complemented by a set of nice sulfur yellow trousers, coupled with this darker upper side, gives the Phoebe away every time. In addition to these things, there's a really great behavioral cue you can use for the Eastern Phoebe, is that it's often bobbing its tail up and down. Phoebes just seem to do this habitually, which makes them pretty easy to ID. It seems in some ways similar to many other flycatchers. It's kind of an earth tone with a light belly and so on and so forth. But it's really a very distinctive bird. Also notice how squat the bird is. It kind of looks like a normal bird that somebody has just kind of squished down from both ends and made it a little bit short and fat. The song of the Eastern Phoebe is very easy. It's called a Phoebe because it says Phoebe, and the song is a repeated "Freebie, freebie." I also don't expect you to know it, but it is kind of nice to keep in your back pocket that they do produce a very distinctive chip call. It's just a clear chip. There's not a lot out there that produces a chip like this, particularly in the types of habitats where you hear the Phoebe. The next bird in our group, the olive-sided flycatcher, might be one of my favorite. In general, olive-sided flycatchers are pretty easy to identify. The first thing you'll typically notice when you see an olive-sided flycatcher is the general impression and the habitat and the posture. So this image right here shows how you typically see an olive-sided flycatcher at a distance, sitting very much erect on a very open perch, like a large stick or a dead snag or something of that nature. They like to sit way out in the open where they can watch for flying insects that they quickly run out or fly out and grab. So also notice that this guy, just like the Phoebe, has a distinctive vest, and you can see it from a mile off on this bird. And this one here, which is a little closer, we've got this kind of streaky, smudgy vest. It's a little bit more streaky than on the Phoebe and quite a bit more extensive than on the Phoebe. Notice how it contrasts with the white belly and undertail coverts, just like in this bird here. We also have kind of this dark head and back, kind of like a Phoebe, but not. The shape is totally different. We don't have the distinctive white throat that the Phoebe had, somewhat, but not nearly as much so. We don't have the very long tail that the Phoebe tends to have. and the posture. The Phoebe was very short and squat. This guy tends to be very long and vertical. Also look here. You don't always see this on an olive-sided flycatcher, but sometimes you do. When the bird is at rest and the wings are lowered kind of down to the side, it exposes this side, this white flank here, which can sort of show up in this area. It's not a rump, but the flank can kind of be exposed when the wing is lowered, showing that little white spot, which is pretty distinctive. Without a doubt, the olive-sided flycatcher's call is one of my favorite calls of any bird. The olive-sided flycatcher says, "Quick, 3 beers!" I don't expect you guys to know the pit-pit call, but they produce that as well. It's very reminiscent of the song, sort of a shortened version of it, but they produce excited pit calls. As our flycatchers go on, we're going to get a little bit more and more tricky. So the eastern Wood-Pewee is probably the first of these tricky ones. And to be honest with you, the eastern Wood-Pewee trips me up even from time to time. For one, it kind of resembles an Empidonax flycatcher in some ways. For example, it's got this brownish gray color. Notice it's a very light gray-brown, not like the olive-sided flycatcher, which is a very dark kind of gray, or the Phoebe, which is that dark gray-brown. But it's kind of a light gray-brown with light wing bars, resembling an Empidonax flycatcher. One thing that tells you right off the bat, though, it's not one of the Empidonax flycatchers, is that we have no eye ring here. This is a really key characteristic to keep you from mixing it up with an Empidonax flycatcher. And again, we have our favorite little characteristic, the vest. The eastern Wood-Pewee has kind of this really smudgy vest. It's not nearly as distinctive as on our olive-sided flycatcher, but it definitely has that. The other thing that makes the eastern Wood-Pewee distinctive is the vocalization. To be honest with you, each field season I probably see 2 eastern Wood-Pewees, but I probably record 300 or 400 of them on point counts because they make so much noise. The eastern Wood-Pewee, like the Phoebe, is named because of the call it produces. The pewee usually says, "Pee-wee, pee-woo." Okay, moving on to our next bird. This is the first of the Empidonax flycatchers. In my opinion, it's probably the easiest of the Empidonax flycatchers, but in many areas it's the rarest of the Empidonax flycatchers. So we know it's an Empidonax flycatcher because it's got a complete eye ring, or at least some sort of eye ring, as well as these light-colored wing bars. It doesn't tend to be extraordinarily long bird like the olive-sided or the eastern Wood-Pewee. It's just kind of a short little bird. The thing that makes the yellow-bellied flycatcher distinctive from the other Empidonax flycatchers is this whole kind of overall yellowish tone to it, particularly on the belly. But even in the head, the eye ring is yellow, for goodness sake. The whole bird is just kind of this yellow-green, which is going to be quite different than the other Empidonax flycatchers. It also produces a song that sounds very similar to the least flycatcher, which I'll play both for you now. The yellow-bellied flycatcher is just a slight variation of the least flycatcher. We'll talk about the least flycatcher in a bit, but the least flycatcher says chibak, 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 which is this. And the yellow-bellied, which is the one we're talking about now, has a sort of more of a rolling song that sounds like the bird is saying, "Kill it, kill it." Notice the rate of repetition, much slower than the least. Here's the least again. And here's our yellow-bellied saying, "Kill it, kill it." Okay, so the final 4 flycatchers we're going to talk about here, I'm calling the challenging 4 Empidonax species. And I have them all on the same slide here because I'm not expecting you, luckily for you, to identify them to the species level based on visual identification alone. They're quite a bit easier to tell. If you have them in the hand, you can measure wings, you can look at leg color really easily, things like that. But we don't have that luxury, so we're going to focus mostly on visual identification just as a genus, as well as the song. Fortunately, all 4 of these species, though they're quite difficult to tell apart visually, are very easy to tell apart based on vocals. So the first bird, just kind of focus on the red box. Our first bird here, the least flycatcher, isn't actually impossible to tell apart from visual. It tends to have a really large head, as well as a very bold, complete white eye ring. This picture actually doesn't even show it that well, but the white eye ring is very complete, and the head is very large with relation to the size of the body, and that kind of gives the bird overall kind of a cute appearance, or at least I've been told the least flycatcher is the cutest of the Empidonax flycatchers. And again, that song is a repeated chibak, chibak, chibak. It's very easy to miss least flycatchers during point counts because that song, it doesn't really sound like a song, it just sounds like a quick call, and it's easy to ignore. Okay, so the next guy is the Acadian flycatcher. The Acadian flycatcher is very similar to the other Empidonax flycatchers, so we're not going to focus too much on the visual ID. One thing that I've been told is a really good characteristic is this long primary flight feather projection, which can even be seen in the field. And you can see that it's considerably longer than, say, the alder flycatcher here, which has kind of a short, nubby primary projection. This has a nice long primary projection. It's not quite as clear on the willow, but this one also has a kind of a moderate to short primary projection. So that sometimes is helpful. But generally the song is the best way to identify the Acadian flycatcher. And the way that I remember it is Acadian has a lot of syllables. And because it's got so many syllables, maybe it's really hard for you to remember it. When you're trying to remember the song, it's got a lot of syllables, you have to strain to think about it, and then when you suddenly remember it, you exclaim, "That's it!" And that is the song of the Acadian flycatcher. And a loud, sharp, "That's it!" Okay, 2 more Empidonax flycatchers. The alder flycatcher, we're not even going to spend a lot of time discussing the visual identification, but the alder flycatcher and the willow flycatcher were considered the same species for a long time. But fortunately, their songs are quite easy to tell apart. The alder flycatcher has a sort of raspy, harsh rebeal. Okay, our final challenging Empidonax flycatcher is the willow flycatcher. The willow flycatcher also has a very distinctive song. It says, "Hit spew." Okay, so that does it for the flycatchers. Let's not waste any time getting into the thrushes. We're going to begin with the eastern bluebird. The eastern bluebird really doesn't need a lot of identification tips. It's blue on the back. It's got this kind of rufusy brownish orange breast with a white belly. And the female is essentially a muted version of the male. We have a partial white eye ring, which can be helpful, not so distinctive on the male. it's a pretty easy ID. The vocals are also pretty straightforward. We have a song and a call for this one. The song sounds like the bird is saying a very rich warbling note, something along the lines of cheer chivel charmer or something like that. They also produce a very mournful cheer call. Okay, the American robin hardly needs an introduction, but just a brief overview of the robin. We have a bird with a dark gray back and a kind of a warm-colored breast. It runs around a lot on the ground, in lawns, things like that. It doesn't really spend a lot of time in the trees or in dense vegetation. Males, shown on the left here, have a black head with some white facial markings. The female has a gray head with similar facial markings. Also notice that the breast color of the female is a much lighter rufusy brown, as opposed to the male's like very dark rufus. The song is also very easy. In fact, you should do everything you can to remember the robin song really right off the get-go, because it's easy to compare a lot of other bird songs to the robin song. Scarlet tanager is very similar to the robin, rose-breasted grosbeak is similar to the robin, and red-eyed vireo, as we'll discuss in a bit, is also similar to the robin. So, to begin with the robin, the song is a repeated cheerily, cheerio, cheery up. And here's another individual. Notice that it has almost kind of a metallic quality to it. Metallic and very flute-like. In addition to the primary call or primary song, the robin has a couple of secondary calls that it does quite a lot that are good to know. It produces a series of put calls as well as peak calls, such as these. Those are typical alarm calls for a robin. The other call that the species produces very often, is the whinny call. A whinny almost like a very small horse. The next of our thrushes is the wood thrush. We have 4 brown thrushes we're going to talk about, and the wood thrush is the first of them. It's not terribly hard. In fact, none of these are terribly hard, but we're going to go through them one at a time. The first thing you'll notice about the wood thrush, or maybe the first thing you should notice on any thrush, is the color of the back. The wood thrush has a very rich, dark chocolatey colored back. The second thing you might look at on a thrush is the color of the breast and the arrangement, or maybe the quality of the spotting. So we've got a dark chocolatey brown thrush with this white breast with very bold black spots. Additionally, we see that the auricular kind of has this speckled look to it. But the main two things are the breast and the back. Also notice that we've got an ovenbird here for comparison, which also has kind of a chocolatey back with spotting on the breast. But notice that on the ovenbird, these spots almost form streaks. And we have this kind of light colored brown base color with a reddish cap, which is absent on the wood thrush. Also notice that on our wood thrush, we have a nice white eye ring. These pink legs are very distinctive, much pinker than on the other thrushes we're going to talk about. All of the thrushes really have very flute-like songs, and the wood thrush is certainly no exception to that. The primary song is a beautiful flute-like "Iole, leo," and some variation on that. Also notice those rising buzzy notes at the end of each phrase. In addition to that, the wood thrush produces a bup volley, which is a series of bups, and a pit volley, which is a series of pits. Here's an example of a pit volley. Like the bird is saying, pit, 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 pit. And here are bup volleys and pit volleys. Those volleys are produced only by the wood thrush. The hermit thrush is one of the most talented songsters in the North Woods. They produce a beautiful song, an enchanting flute-like song. But before we get to the vocalizations, let's talk about the identification. Just like with our wood thrush, we focus our attention on the back of the bird. So this individual has this kind of light brownish gray back. But one thing to notice here on the hermit thrush is while the mantle here is a light gray-brown, this fades into a very reddish-brown tail. The contrast between our upper parts here, this light gray-brown, with this very rich, ruddy color, is what tells you that it's a hermit thrush. It may seem like a subtle thing, but no other thrush has that set of characteristics. Also notice the primary flight feathers, particularly on this individual here, but certainly true here as well, have this panel of rufous color as well. On the face, we don't have that huge white obvious eye ring, a little bit of an eye ring, but not much. We also don't have anything really unusual going on in the lores, and that's going to become relevant when we come to talk about the Swainson's thrush in a moment. Also take a look at our breast. Unlike with the wood thrush, which has this very nice bright white breast with very bold spotting all the way down the flank, this bird has kind of spotting that stops about halfway down, and the flank is largely unspotted. We also see the background color is kind of smudgy, whereas the wood thrush is a nice clean color. So we've got kind of spotting going halfway. So contrast that with our wood thrush, spotting all the way. This is one with spotting halfway. Let's talk about the vocals. I referred to that flute-like call, true of all the thrushes. The hermit thrush has this enchanting call that begins with a singular whistle and then trails off at the end. Very easy bird call to learn, one of my favorites. Here's another bird. In addition to the primary song, the hermit thrush produces a towhee-like way, way. The next of our brown thrushes is the Veery. So going along with our previous identification scheme, first thing we're going to look for is the color of the back. We see that this bird has kind of this reddish-brown back overall. Remember with our hermit thrush, we had a sort of a gray-brown back that sort of transitioned into a bright red tail. Here we don't have that. We have kind of a reddish-colored brown overall, the entire bird. Also, let's look at our spotting. On many individuals, we have pretty much no spotting at all. The way that I learned to remember that is the Veery is very plain. It has very little spotting. It has no real markings on the face. We don't have anything going on in the lores, in contrast with the Swainsons that we're going to talk about in a moment. Pretty plain, kind of a reddish-brown bird. It also produces a pretty easy set of vocalizations. The song is said to sound like the bird is saying, veer, 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 veer. But notice that this is a descending spiral. Think of it like going in a spiral downward, like down the toilet drain. In addition to the song, a descending spiral, sounding like the bird is saying veer, the calls also sound like the bird is saying veer. In my opinion, it has two calls, one that sounds like it's saying veer, and one that sounds like it's saying fjord. Here's the first. And the second. Okay, the final of our brown thrushes is the Swainson's thrush. Okay, again, keeping with our pattern, we look at the back and we see no contrast between the tail and the upper parts, telling us that this is not a hermit thrush, so maybe it's a Veery. We look at the breast and we see that it's pretty well spotted, much more so than the Veery, and the spotting kind of only goes halfway. The belly and breast are mostly unspotted, or the belly and undertail region are mostly unspotted, telling us it's not a wood thrush. We also now know it's not a Veery, so that leaves only the Swainson's thrush. The final thing that tips us off that it's a Swainson's thrush is this set of buffy spectacles. If you look at the lores, we have this spot here, which looks like the bird is wearing a pair of buff-colored glasses, which is another distinctive trait of the Swainson's thrush. So here are those buffy spectacles for you. The Swainson's thrush, we don't hear a lot of those singing on point counts, but just so you know what they sound like in case you do encounter one, think of the song of the Veery, which was a veer, 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 going down the drain. This song spirals upwards. Okay, so let's review our brown thrushes. First thing we look at when we see a thrush is what's going on in the breast and belly. We've got our wood thrush here, which has a spotted breast and belly that spots well down into the flanks in the belly. Our Swainson's thrush and hermit thrush, the spotting continues, but only to about midway down. The spotting is also quite pronounced. It's dark spotting on both the Swainson's and the hermit thrush, but it doesn't continue all the way down. On the Veery, in contrast, the spotting is pretty much restricted to the throat and doesn't extend very much. The spots themselves are also kind of a light color, whereas they're black on our Swainson's and hermit thrushes over here. Okay, so the next thing we look at is our back color. Our wood thrush is a nice chocolatey brown. Our Swainson's thrush and hermit thrush are kind of a gray-brown on the back, but our hermit thrush has this reddish-colored tail and wings. Our Veery has kind of this reddish-brown overall with nothing terribly distinctive about that. We also have buffy spectacles on our Swainson's thrush. Okay, sorry about that technical issue there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our vireos, beginning with the red-eyed vireo, and we'll cover 4 vireos today. The red-eyed vireo is a pretty easy bird to identify. We've got a gray cap, this kind of olive-colored back, and a white underpart. We also have a black line through the eye, which is accentuating a red eye that's often not clearly red. The song is also very easy to identify, but before we get to the actual song itself, I'm going to remind you of the American Robin song, the cheerily, cheerio, cheery, cheeria. Now imagine if you took each of those phrases from the American Robin song and split them up by short pauses. So it sounded maybe a bit like this. If you were to do that, you'd get something that sounded similar to the red-eyed vireo, and therefore we get a red-eyed vireo with a song mnemonic that sounds like, "Here I am, where are you? I am here, where are you?" And notice that the song seems to just go on and on and on, with the bird saying, "Here I am, where are you? I am here, here are you," that kind of thing. Remember the tone and quality of the red-eyed vireo song. The next two vireos are going to be compared directly to the red-eyed. So here it is again. Okay, the blue-headed vireo is a pretty easy one to identify as well. We've got kind of this, essentially a blue head, the olive back, kind of similar to our red-eyed vireo, but these white wing bars. The flank has this kind of greenish color, but otherwise a white throat and a white belly and breast. Pretty distinctive bird visually. These white spectacles will give it away every time. The song is a little bit trickier, but not too bad. So let's take back to our base vireo song, the red-eyed vireo song. The blue-headed vireo is a variation on that, but much sweeter. Almost just ridiculously sweet. Also notice how much slower it is. I've also been told that the blue-headed vireo sounds a bit like he's trying to experiment with different calls to hear maybe what it might sound like if he did this or tried this little thing. And this is in contrast to the red-eyed vireo, which is much more consistent and much less sweet. Here's our blue-headed one more time. Okay, moving on to our next vireo, we have the yellow-throated vireo. The yellow-throated vireo is pretty easy to identify. We've got these gray wings, white wing bars, kind of like on our blue-headed, and we've got a similar pattern to what we saw on the blue-headed, except instead of a blue head, we've got green, and we've got yellow spectacles instead of white, and a bright yellow throat. The yellow-throated vireo has this odd mix of characteristics that makes it pretty much distinctive. Now, as for the song, let's think back to our red-eyed vireo. And imagine if that red-eyed vireo had a sore throat, giving its voice a vocal burr. That's how you achieve the song of the yellow-throated vireo, a very burry red-eyed vireo that almost has a sound like it's saying 3-8, 3-8, 3-8. Okay, for our final vireo and our final bird in this installment, we have the Warbling Vireo. The Warbling Vireo is somewhat tricky in that it doesn't really resemble the other vireos. We do have this hooked bill that's typical of the vireos, but the bird is gray overall, in fact resembling in more ways a Tennessee warbler than anything, also because it's a fairly small little warbler. But we notice that we don't have the greenish back that the Tennessee warbler has, and overall it's just shaped like a vireo. The song, which is often given from large trees along the banks of a lake or a river, is a rambling, rich warble, and the mnemonic that I learned was, "If I see it, I will seize it and I'll squeeze it till it squirts," as if the bird was talking to a caterpillar. Okay, and I think that concludes this edition of the CEAP Avian Training video series. Remember that there's no substitute for time in the field, and you should get out and do as much birding as you can before the field season. And let me know if you have any questions about anything in this video or any other video. Good luck out there, and have a good one.